One of the first things that I would request the person who's showing it to help me to look at the first three slides one after the other, please. If the person who's doing that could show me the first three slides. Yes. The next one. And the next one, please. Right. Thank you very much. Right. One of the things that I'm doing here is a part of this, the title of this paper, especially the idea of perpetual grief, is taken from an article entitled Strength from Perpetual Grief, How Aboriginal People Experience the Bushfire Crisis. This was published in The Conversation in January 2020. And one of the things that it says is, how do you support people forever attached to a landscape after an inferno tears through their homelands, decimating native food sources, burning through ancient scarred trees, and destroying ancestral and totemic plants and animals? The disastrous and traumatic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, as we all know, has in a way pushed back the horror of one of the worst bushfires in Australia in 2019-20. However, as the world continues to confront one disaster after another, and as so poignantly pointed out by Professor Pillai in the morning, we are indeed at a very important juncture to remind ourselves of the crucial role of Indigenous knowledge systems towards environmental sustainability. One of the things that I would like to engage with is the relationship with land as fostered by Aboriginal communities in Australia and the role of elders in the community. The next slide, please. The next slide, as you could see, is another instance from Twitter, which was there. You can see the images over there. And one of the things it says, I hope it will recover. I hope that Indigenous knowledge and expertise takes precedence in the forward management of their natural environments. This requires Indigenous people and systems leading the process, not being tapped on or our knowledge excerpted and crippled into failing models. Right? And this is again an instance of the ongoing crisis that I'm talking about. Something that also happened in September last year. I think it was in around September last year that one had this discussion with members of LitCrit on the impact of COVID-19 and Indigenous communities in India, for instance, and it brought us very deep-rooted relationships as well. Australia's oldest inhabitants have believed in a natural world that comprises beings that cooperate rather than coerce a world to fatalistic submission. Further, Aboriginal Australians believe in harmonious coexistence and not in irresponsible control of and interference in ecogenic agencies. So I'm trying to look into Aboriginal Australian interventions, which would try to explore the ethics and criteria for understanding Indigenous knowledge and for integrating it within the framework of sustainable development. I'm also at this point reminded of something that Aboriginal elder Bobby Skies told. And one of the things, this was a conference on post-colonialism, and her response was, why have they left? Right? So it speaks about a continuous struggle with forces that encroach upon one's own land, upon one's own sense of being. And if you go on to the next slide, please, it will give you an instance of what I mean by perpetual grief. Uh, it's a particular grief to lose forever what connects you to a place in the landscape. Our ancestors felt it, our elders felt it, and now we are feeling it all over again as we watch how the mistreatment and neglect of our land and waters for generations and the pig-headed foolishness of coal-obsessed climate change denialists turn everything and everyone to ash. As I speak to you today, we have one of the most important climate change seminars are being held um, online, of course, in North America with indigenous communities talking about climate change and their processes of dealing with the damage that has been inflicted on our lands. And I'm tempted at here to, before I go into the Australian context, I'm also tempted at here to talk about somebody like Janet Armstrong, who is from the Okanagan in British Columbia in Canada, and who has been very vocal in her understanding of the preservation of the environment for the community that she loves and derives her inspiration from. And one of the things that she tells us is, I'm claimed and owned by this land, the Okanagan. Voices that move within as my experience of existence do not awaken as words. Instead, they move within as the colors, patterns, and movements of a beautiful, kind Okanagan landscape. It's extremely interesting because one of the words that she uses is the Sikhs word Timix, and which refers, it's TMIX, which refers to the ecology of the land, including all life forms of the place, consisting of many relationships. The concept emanates from the Sikhs language and is in fact illuminated in the oral story tradition. Something that I'm going to come back to at the end of my talk. And the word things which I'm using, albeit in a Canadian context, but I find it's extremely interesting in terms of the philosophical positions followed by Aboriginal scholars in Australia, is this human duty to nature. So the word allows us to perceive, the word remix allows us to perceive the depth of the language and the seed's knowledge of ecology. It's a way to see existence in that the Phoenix is the life force of a place. So what's happening is that the seeing an image in the word in a particular way of an indigenous language is that it is trying to show us the many strands. It's a response to the moral issue of human utility of other life forms, the responsibility that has been displayed by Aboriginal communities. And it's the foundation of an egalitarian type of governance, which extends in relation to other groups surrounding the territory. So it's Aboriginal slash indigenous knowledge systems, particularly ecological knowledge, can be seen in the judicious practices arising out of the wisdom that the ecology of the territory or a living whole system. And it requires human compliance in order to have a better understanding of its regenerative requirements and to interact in ways that is not destructive, right? And that becomes extremely used, especially in terms of non-destructive use of land resources. Yeah, if you move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah. So along with grief, there is a great deal of anger. And I think the next slide gives you an idea of this that's happening here. And what is going on in Australia, ongoing colonization, that's what's going on. This land was nurtured in reciprocal relationships with First Nations people for some 120,000 years. and it's a result of 200 odd years of extractive invasion, right? The next slide, please. Okay. So one of the things that you see over here is Indigenous knowledge and the different ways it branches out in different different ways of understanding the world around you, be it in terms of local knowledge, be it in terms of agriculture, food, biodiversity, culture, performance, education, ethics, science, technology, elders, something that I'll come back to again. The next slide, please, again. So the purpose over here is to place Indigenous perspectives at the center of inquiry. And that's what's happening over here. And it involves a certain respect towards relationships, certain respect towards understanding. In the keynote address in the morning, one of the things that I was really intrigued by is as a response to a question, Professor Ryan mentioned how the word informant can be tricky. And it is indeed tricky because it speaks of disrespect, it speaks of mistrust within Indigenous communities. This particular model is therefore an example of how Indigenous communities try to perceive themselves, how they look into their ideas. The next slide, please. Right? So this is how Indigenous information protocols work. This is how one understands the relationship between Indigenous knowledge systems. One of the ways of doing this is through the role of the elders in the community. According to Yolanda Walker, it is through our elders that the spirit of Aboriginal people is kept alive. Elders are indeed integral to the Indigenous space, and therefore they provide a crucial site for the cross-cultural negotiation of subjectivity. So what is happening in the process is that over here, aging is recoded and re-signified, leading to the formulation of new protocols and paradigmatic shifts. Elders are within Indigenous communities are marked by qualities of leadership, cultural knowledge, and the ability to execute decisions. They provide counter-imperial responses to the colonial trajectory of patriarchy, gendered violence, and social hierarchy. So often the degree of maturity in the stages of life, rather than chronological biological age, defines an elder. Further, as a repository of memory, teachings, and story, they are perceived as an institution open to possibilities of both manipulation, perhaps, and also renegotiation in the context of Indigenous international bodies such as United Nations, or in terms of issues of identity, violence, and Indigenous sovereignty. So what I'm trying to look at is I'm trying to position the symbolic concept of an elder within a global setting, because it paves the way, I believe, towards an apparently seamless and homogeneous reunification of Indigenous communities. So what is the role that Indigenous elders have within the communities? And they try to take cognizance of the processes by which rights to imagination can have been denied, actually, because of the fractured politics of contemporary societies and consequent transformations. Elders actually foreground the capacity of Indigenous people to represent themselves and determine their futures. So in this process, elders rearticulate Indigenous subjectivity, agency, and cultural recovery. I give you one instance from Australia to prove my point. In the early 60s, the federal government of Australia which had jurisdiction in the Northern Territory, uh, would grant a bauxite mining lease to a multinational company called Nabalco on the Arnhem Land Reserve. The decision understandably enraged Yolngu elders that included senior artists such as Mawalan Marika and Munguruwe Yunipingu, who felt that the mining would be a gross violation of the sacred sites of their homelands, and the government had no right to permit such an action without consulting the indigenous community. In the August of 1963, after the failure of their initial entreaties, the Yolngu elders devised two petitions to be presented in the Parliament of Australia. Written both in Yolngu Matha and in English, the petitions were unique as they were written onto bark, painted with Yolngu designs of charcoal, clay pipe, and ochre. The petitioners identified themselves as members of different communities across Australia. This is a very large list, and they demanded an acknowledgement of the sacred ties to the land and requested cognition of the gross neglect and injustice meted on to Aboriginal Australia. Ironically, even though from within Indigenous Australia, the petitions themselves were received as foreign in terms of their format, for the Yolngu people, the petitions compelled white Australia to acknowledge the Yolngu view of life. According to an official history of Australian democracy, the petition should be perceived as first documents bridging Commonwealth law as it then stood and the indigenous laws of the land. In fact, the petition would contain clan designs of all the areas that were threatened by the mining, and not just a series of pictures, but it would represent the title of the country under law. So, and therefore there would be two panels: threatened area, which crossed the boundaries of the two moieties. And so this was a very interesting iconographic image that one had at that point of time. Move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So if you move on to the next slide, we find, and this was something that was spoken about in the morning as well, different ways of understanding how rights are understood. Because you see, justice for the petitions that I just spoke about, justice was denied both by the Parliament and the Supreme Court. But the petitions would lead to this nationwide protest by Indigenous people of Australia. And it also led to a series of bark petitions to Australian prime ministers and the Commonwealth Parliament over the years. So now it seemed that the bark petitions are seen as a way to pave the way for Aboriginal land rights, proclaimed in 76, and it not only initiates the first legal action for land rights in Australia, but it gives coherence and power to the Aboriginal struggle in Australia and indigenized petitionary form. So you see, the bark petitions that I spoke about draw attention to perceptions of value, whereby elders attempted to create this indigenous space of negotiation within an apathetic society, and sought to utilize imaginative political resources from within traditional cultures. So they're known as the Irkala bark petitions, and it nurtured societal conversation on issues of lived experiences, shared sufferings, and orthodoxies. It offers a window to ways in which communities could take control over the forces that operate on them. The slide that you see on your screen is one way of looking at it, the idea of fires, the idea of controlled fire management practices that paved the way for healing, as I was speaking about. The next slide as well, please. Yeah. So this is another instance of patch burning in the Midlands region of Tasmania. And it's again drawing on traditional Aboriginal knowledge and in terms of modern fire management. Uh, One of the ways of also dealing with this, because we need to remember that it's not really until 1992 that Australia's High Court recognizes Aboriginal rights to land, and Eddie Koiki Mabo successfully claimed uninterrupted ownership of his people's traditional land at Mare Island. And the Australian government would finally admit, if only on an anthropocentrically logical grounds of admission, that Australia was terra nullius. So this was the falsehood of the claim. So, and one of the ways of understanding the intervention provoked or initiated by the elders through the bark petitions or thereafter is a way of understanding a meaningful relationship that's cultivated between elders and other members of the community, which is an art in itself. So it functions as a witness to a timeless tradition, as well as a repository of memory of the complex social and material realities of contemporary Indigenous communities. An intervention in the context of Australia in terms of community building and continuity between generations working towards sustainability can also be seen in the Fire Sticks Alliance Indigenous Corporation. The next slide, please. So, according to their website, implementing fire to enhance ecosystem health within culturally connected landscapes, improve habitat condition and connectivity. So, Fire Sticks ultimately strives to empower Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities to work towards healthy, functional, and resilient landscapes. And such modes of intervention are crucial since a very minuscule section of Australians today have paid attention to pre-1788 human-environment relationships. One of the books that was mentioned at the keynote as well is Cranston and Zeller's eco-critical study, The Literal Zone, which testifies to these relationships in the context of Australian literary studies. You've had environmental historians like Bill Gamage, The Biggest Estate on Earth, How Aborigines Made Australia, and other narratives which I'm not mentioning right now because it was also mentioned in the keynote in the morning. And also perhaps because all of these books give you a very limited body of criticism that acknowledge the role of Indigenous people in sustainability. Local knowledge and spiritual bonding with the land are integral to traditional Aboriginal fire practices. In fact, before white settlement, Aboriginal people were constantly at par with the landscape and traditionally burned country by walking the land. So it basically meant that they could control the timing and spread of fire as well as its ecological effects. And one of the things that I find in this text is this whole idea of an Aboriginal person saying, they stole our land and I thought that was enough, but now they just let it bloody burn. Our Mother Earth is dying and all we can do is to watch it die and hear her screams. She's angry at not being looked after, and I'm angry she wasn't looked after. The next slide, please. And this is one of the most important images that I feel. The next slide, please. The slide which gives you a sense of Badugili, and one of the things that I wanted to show here is this. The Badugili is this First Nations connection to the land and which is shown every year, every evening at Sydney. And this is a video that I wanted everyone to see because it is really a beautiful one. We'll kind of stop at 3 minutes at the video because that's just a stop, and we can continue later on. If you could show the video, please. Yeah, so this gives you an idea of the house and the video.
The Hermansburg art movement of watercolours was founded by the famous Albert Namatjira. Mervyn Rabuncha continues painting country in that style. He paints about the Fink River at the foot of Mount Hermansburg. It is surrounded by red desert, stunted trees and spinifex, and is flanked by the MacDonald Ranges. For his people, the Western Arunta, the deep gorges and arid plains witness harsh drought and high temperatures. As the winds move to form clouds, through the red dust we see the life grow along one of the oldest waterways. The water is there, you just need to read country. The Black Cockatoo is a totemic bird for Gidja peoples of the Kimberley West. It's a warning bird. Their song will alert us to impending rain, and so the seasons change with the moon cycles. Painted by Mabel Julie, she only uses ochre and tells the well-known dreaming story of the stars and moon and the paintings of mountains on her father's country. She paints country and explores climate change within her stories.
Thank you, Annie. One of the things that we must acknowledge and understand is the traumatic colonial practices of the past 200 plus years and the traumatic inheritance of dislocation, dispossession, assimilation, and racism that has been integral to Indigenous communities, and which continues to affect different Indigenous communities across the world, India not being far behind. So the bushfire adds on to this layer of trauma and complexity that perhaps triggered past traumas as well, not only to Indigenous communities as a collective, but also individual members of the community. And it is in this context, therefore, that remembrance becomes imperative. And I end with this particular poem by Leonel Pugatti, and I'm going to just read the last stanza and I will end there. It's called Ecology. Later, I'm digging sticks, then I'm seeds winnowed for damper. I'm club, woomera, an agile, well-balanced bandicoot, flying fox and an aboriginal. Our systems woven from an ecosystem. So don't send us to pollution. We are just trying to picture this life without frustration. Thank you very much.
I think Debashree's very informative talk. What she was trying to do through that was to take a look at the crucial role that Indigenous tribes and Indigenous knowledge systems have nurtured towards environmental sustainability. That was the crux of the argument that she was trying to make. In this context, she was talking about the role of the elders of the community, of Indigenous communities, who very inherently believed in a natural world that comprises beings that cooperate rather than coerce. Maybe that's where there are very significant parallels that we have with our own tribal cultures and tribal, Indigenous knowledge systems. She also talked about the kind of harmonious coexistence that is at the root of their philosophies, deeper philosophies with regard to environment, with regard to ways of living, with regard to livelihoods, etc. She talked about the interventions made by these Aboriginal elders. I found that extremely interesting, the kind of petitioning that happened on their part, and she tried to explore the ethics, therefore, the necessity also of understanding indigenous knowledges and for integrating them within our own sustainable development goals. What is very interesting, what I found very interesting in her talk was the parallels that can be drawn. See, for example, fire management techniques that many of the indigenous tribes use, even here in India, as also in Australia. I think there are different names by which they are called, but I think in Australia they're called cultural burns, which are practiced by indigenous communities. They actually burn. They let the wood burn because they think that what is created needs also to be destroyed. But this is not a destructive burning in that sense. It's a cool burning where there are blazes which will not go beyond the height of a human knee. Very carefully designed cool burning. Continuously, it keeps on burning across the landscape, but it doesn't destroy ecosystems. It doesn't destroy, in the same manner and in the same magnitude as the raging bushfires. So there are fires, definitely, but there is a philosophy underneath that, of creation, of preservation and destruction, which I think is also part of, our own Indian philosophies, where it comes in a cyclical pattern. It is part and parcel of the way in which life itself functions. So a deeper philosophy rather than the consuming bushfires of today. But then her paper also set me thinking, even as we talk about two entirely different, maybe dialectically opposed ways of looking at, deeper philosophies of looking at forests and ecosystems and space and time. At the same time, in the context of the huge paradigm shifts, the huge tectonic shifts that have happened as far as human habitations are concerned, the way our greed has maybe destroyed, even as I'm talking, some endangered species across the globe are being destroyed. So that is the pace at which, that is the way in which things are dying out right in front of our eyes. But even as we lament their loss, I think the question that she was also trying to raise is, how do we narrate this grief? How do we talk about this grief? How do we maybe transform a deep personal understanding of this grief, the lament that stems from within us, into a social lament, a lament that will chart the history of my society, maybe forge deeper bonds that will, for all times, prevent or help prevent the repetition of such disasters. What is very interesting is that someone called Maurice Blanchard argues that narrating disaster, whether it be global, whether it be national, whether it be local or personal, is an impossible task. Because to narrate a disaster, to narrate a grief, it's so difficult to articulate it. Of course, we try different ways by which we articulate grief. But how do we articulate? How do we really articulate what is deep within? That is so traumatic that it has created a schism in our own being. It has created ruptures in our souls. How do we narrate it? How do we narrate grief? I thought that the way the paper tried to move towards that was very interesting. So in a sense, it is also the limit of writing, as many people have argued, because language fails you. You who believe that you are the keeper of such a wonderful language, the felicity with which you express. But there are times, there are points in your life when, and maybe the bushfire, I think, is definitely one such instance, where you look at this raging, consuming fire, and there is a lament that rises up within you. There is a lament that cannot be curbed, but it is also a lament that cannot be described. It's a lament that cannot be written, because it is a lament where language fails you. Literally speechless. You lack the language to talk about it, to express it in maybe decipherable human terminology. So as I was thinking about this question that the paper raised about how do we articulate our grief, I was also reminded of a very significant passage from Roland Barthes. Barthes, I just want to quote him there. Barthes said, I quote him, "There is a time when death is an event, an adventure, and as such mobilizes, interests, activates, tetanizes. And then one day, it is no longer an event. It is another duration, compressed, insignificant, not narrated, grim, without recourse. True mourning, not susceptible to any narrative dialectic. Tragedies often have all the making of the event that Barthes was trying to narrate. Maybe when I read Barthes in this context, I thought of this event that Barthes was trying to talk about, that initially mobilizes, that initially sparks interest, but then after a certain time, it becomes compressed, it becomes insignificant. I think that is the move that we need to stop here. Maybe a conference of this kind will help us not to get to a point where we think that such fires, such raging, consuming fires are insignificant, are too grim to be narrated. I think that is the point when silence pervades. That is the point when we fail as cartographers of grief. Let us not reach that point. Let us continue to talk about this grief. Let us continue to mourn. I was also thinking of that very popular film Rudali, where this whole idea of people coming to mourn with you, to lament with you, to beat their breasts and cry, attempting to narrate a grief that still remains unnarratable. So these are the thoughts that Debashree's paper sparked off in me. I think they are very, very significant pointers, both to some of the interventions that Aboriginal knowledge systems can engender at one level, but also to the necessity of maybe becoming the cartographers of grief in our own times, not to be desensitized, not to be tetanized, not to be pervaded by silence in such a manner that we fail to respond to the grief itself. I think that is the purpose of conferences and seminars and presentations like this. I don't know whether I've done justice to Debashree's paper, but I would like to say that the paper is now open for discussion. If there are questions, if there are queries, I'm sure that she would be most happy to address them. Thank you so much, Debashree.